Hello, my name is Allison Kate, and I'm a master's student in the Folk Studies program. My presentation is They Say a Jewish Demon Has Possessed the Groom, Folklore and the Folkloresque in the Film Demon. The 2015 Polish horror film Demon, written and directed by Marcin Rona, chronicles the possession of a young groom on his wedding day by a dibuk. In Jewish folklore, a dibuk is the soul of a dead person that is capable of possessing the living. Alongside the literal narrative of possession, the film also serves as a poignant allegory for relations between Polish Jews and non Jewish Poles during and after the Second World War. The use of a reference specific to Jewish folklore positions the film to effectively scrutinize contemporary Polish discourses surrounding the Holocaust, particularly those concerning the extent to which Poles were complicit or even active participants in the extermination of their Jewish neighbors. In this capacity, the film's debut provides a metaphor of being haunted or possessed by a disquiet past that remains a persistent presence and that actively refuses to be forgotten. This paper will apply a folkloristic perspective in analyzing Demon, as well as locating it within current academic discourse surrounding the influence of folklore on film. This paper will also address the film's use of debut possession to comment on Polish society's struggle to reckon with its history of anti Semitism. It is critical to note that this film was made in the context of an ongoing national dialogue in Poland surrounding the Holocaust. Before the Second World War, Poland had the largest Jewish population in Europe. Around 3.5 million Jews lived in both Poland's urban areas and rural villages, oftentimes sharing spaces with non Jewish neighbors. However, only 10% of Polish Jews survived the Holocaust, with a vast number of these survivors opting not to return or remain in their home country after the war. With the loss of Polish Jews came the loss of Jewish ways of life within Poland, as spaces once previously owned and occupied by Jews were then claimed by non Jews. This legacy of physically occupying the places of victims of the Holocaust has, especially recently, struck an uneasy tone in many works of Polish literature and film. This genre, which scholar Emily Rose Baker has dubbed Polish Holocaust horror, characterizes Poland as a land haunted, literally, figuratively, or both, by the decimation of Jewish life. Additionally, while post war Polish national mythos has gone through phases of recontextualization and interpretation, it has generally situated Poles solely as the victims of German and Russian aggression, and particularly as having nothing to do with the extermination of their Jewish neighbors. This interpretation of history was challenged in 2000 with the revelation that Polish townspeople participated in the 1941 mass murder of the Jews of the town of Jedwabne. This was a tumultuous moment in Polish society that forced a massive collective reevaluation of Poles' understanding of their own personal, local, and national histories, and it continues to be a part of the country's discourse. There remain portions of Polish society that dismiss or do not wish to engage in these historiographic reconsiderations, while others outright contest them, in some cases voicing stances that border on or are blatantly anti Semitic. In reviewing my methodology, I will first discuss relevant scholarship on folklore and film. At various points in the history of folkloristics, there have been several calls for a renewed intellectual interest in the study of film by folklorists. In his 2007 book, Film, Folklore, and Urban Legends, Michael J. Coven argued that the majority of folkloristic forays into film analysis are limited to what he refers to as motif spotting, or identifying elements of films that can be found in the Arndt Thompson Uther Teletype Index or the Thompson Motif Index. While Coven acknowledges that identifying tail types and motifs could be useful for the sake of comparative analysis, he also admits that he holds a quote, disparaging attitude to research that is limited to motif spotting without further engaging with the context in which these motifs or tail types are utilized, as well as how they might impact audience members. In his chapter, Searching for Tail Types and Motifs in the Zombie Film, Coven argues that, quote, the study of folklore and film needs to focus on how ethnographic and anthropological materials are being used within a specific film. He further suggests that such a comparison can lead to discussions regarding how and why certain narratives and tropes become applicable between audiences in a folk context and audiences in a popular culture context. Building on the approaches to folkloristic analysis of film that Coven advocates, I seek to go beyond the methodology of motif spotting and address the functions of culture-specific narratives and motifs within this film. An additional lens I employ in this work is the idea of the folkloresque. Based on the pioneering scholarship of Michael Dillon Foster, Jeffrey Tolbert, and others, the concept of the folkloresque is a relatively recent development in folkloristics. The folkloresque can be described as popular culture's own perception of performance of folklore. It can refer to creative, often commercial products or texts, such as films, that give the impression to the consumer that they derive directly from existing folkloric traditions. It can also create a sense of authenticity derived from an association with real folklore. Jeffrey Tolbert provides the following quote: "The folkloresque enables us to move beyond identification to an integrated study of the thought processes, interests, and goals of creators, as well as audiences of popular culture." The film begins with the arrival of Piotr, a young man in his late 20s, to the rural, unnamed Polish village in which his fiancée and her family have lived for generations. Piotr is a native of London, but the film's dialogue provides vague allusions to his Polish ancestry. The family of his fiancée, Zanetka, with varying degrees of politeness, hesitantly welcome Piotr into the community. On the eve of his wedding to Zanetka, Piotr stays in the old farmhouse that Zanetka's family are gifting to the newlywed couple as their marital home. While surveying the new construction on the property, Piotr finds human remains in the earth, but ultimately decides to rebury them, afraid that this revelation will interfere with his wedding. Upon his wedding the following night, Piotr's happy revelry is interrupted by an increasing state of delirium and illness, including supernatural visions of a young woman amidst the wedding party. Piotr soon collapses and is taken away from the wedding by Zanetka's embarrassed family. He then begins speaking Yiddish as the young woman he's had visions of, Hannah, takes over his body. Through Piotr, Hannah recognizes an old Jewish man attending the party as someone she knew in life, and this elderly man is able to confirm that the spirit of Hannah, as a dibuk, has possessed Piotr. It also becomes increasingly alluded to throughout the film that Zanetka's grandfather was likely involved in Hannah's murder, and that he then took possession of Hannah's family home, the same home Zanetka and Piotr will now inherit. Some members of Zanetka's family and social circle seem to be aware of this dark family history, but remain willfully amnesic and obstinately dismissive upon any suggestion of it. The use of a dibuk, a possessing spirit well established within the Jewish tradition, provides the film with an effective means of playing on a fear based in historical trauma, that the past isn't really past, and that the absent Jew isn't really absent. Part of what makes this film a work of the folkloresque is that it draws upon Jewish folklore, but it is not told from a Jewish perspective per se. This fact is attested to by the title of the film, as well as a moment within the film where a member of the wedding party confides in the mother of the bride, quote, "They say a Jewish demon has possessed the groom." To call a dibuk a demon is a misnomer, an entirely inaccurate way of communicating what a dibuk is. But the non-Jewish members of the wedding party are not equipped with the knowledge of what a dibuk is, and perhaps neither is the film's most immediate intended audience, Poles. So, as Agnisa Kowanitska alludes to in her work on this film, we, the audience, are viewing this phenomenon through how non-Jewish Poles are contextualizing and understanding this markedly Jewish occurrence. In operating within the framework of Jewish folk belief, both the narrative and messaging of the film are, to borrow a phrase from the scholarship of Dr. Timothy Evans, imbued with authenticity. Perhaps devising a horror film in which there's a haunting by a Jewish spirit, but one that is framed in a Christian understanding of haunting, or another scenario by which the haunting spirit is divorced from Jewish tradition, might be less effective. In using a supernatural force located within Jewish folklore as the vehicle for a critique on current Polish Holocaust discourse, this film is lent the sense of authenticity, or even authority, to communicate this particular viewpoint, and likely with the intention of leading the audience to identify with this film's position. This circles back to the quote by Jeffrey Tolbert I referenced earlier, that analyzing works of the folkloresque enables us to pursue an integrated study of the thought processes, interests, and goals of the creators of popular culture. In summation, because of its utilization of Jewish supernatural folklore as a premise for its horror narrative, Demon is successful in leveling a poignant criticism of the factions of Polish society who wish to not reckon with the country's anti-Semitic past. Folklore, therefore, functions as the vehicle for this critique, which is otherwise contextualized by subtle references in action and dialogue. What I have discussed here today is but a small segment of the potential elements of Demon that are worthy of folkloristic analysis. In looking ahead to additional aspects of this film to further analyze, I would like to devote more time to a discussion on the roles of gender in this film and how it relates to gender in traditional debut narratives. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions you may have. Thank you so much for your time, and I will briefly show my references.